Okay, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I'm back with my good friend Bruce Alderman, and we are going to continue the special iQuad edition. Bruce, thanks so much for coming and joining me again.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, looking forward to it. Good morning, and maybe almost afternoon for you. So
yes, indeed it is afternoon, but so this is part two of this long and winding iQuad path I developed. So we're going to bridge a little bit to what we did last time. In fact, there's actually been a slightly new formulation, at least a way to frame, not a difference, but a different angle that might be helpful. And then we'll summarize some of that and drop into the core aspect of this part two, if that works for you.
Sounds good.
All right. And then for people that are listening, remember these iQuad special editions, at least, really are have to be sort of grounded in the PowerPoint, so it does require a visual. We'll put the link of what these so that people can at least scan through them if they are listening audio wise. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and shift up here. Okay, so here we are exploring then part two, where we're going to enrich the identification matrix via the four core subfunctions. So if we recall from last time, the basic entry point on the iQuad coin is that human identity function, which is then symbolized by this rotation. I've been dialoguing with people about this actually over the last 2 weeks, week and a half or so, and in a couple of explanations I've landed on, I have found that it resided well with people when I reframed it as an identification matrix. Okay, and this actually comes right from John. John prompted me in relationship to this in terms of, as he was talking about sort of the agent arena relationship from his recursive relevance realization. He basically said at one point, he's like, well, what you're doing is you're basically creating identities all the time subconsciously. That's the model of the agent arena relationship. So you have an identification matrix. I don't know that he specifically used that term, but I'm sure he'd be happy or fine with it in relationship to what he's trying to describe. So this can be thought of as one's operating system for moving in the world. You know, what you basically intuitively take for granted in making sense out of the world. And so we get just, hey, you're wandering around, I pulled this from, or noticed the parallels with Harman in relationship to object-oriented ontology. He's talked about sort of like how we think about objects, I think he's got a 3-table model, or one point where he talks about the table common sense-wise, the table scientifically, and the table through his object-oriented ontology. Right now, we're just at a very sort of common sense level. We're just saying, hey, you would walk into a room and it would just, if you're a sort of quote unquote typical functioning adult, you would see tables and chairs. And if you were familiar with the tools and technologies of the environment, you would immediately just identify those. Okay. Let's say if you would be surprised if, let's say, somebody were playing a trick on you in some miraculous way and had projected a hologram and you presumed it was a real table and you sat down in a chair and fell through it. And all of a sudden you're like, whoa, and that would wake up your identification matrix as not affording you the opportunity to flow smoothly in the agent arena relationship. So does that sound reasonable from where you are, Bruce?
It does, yes. And I'm thinking about something that correlates with some of my own work, but I'm holding back on bringing it in because I want to see where you go with that.
Great. So we can deepen this analysis. Actually, one other version of that Harman talks about in his just analysis of ontology can be thought of as sort of deepening it into, say, a scientific ontology. So for me, as somebody who's pretty well steeped in natural science and science in general, and learned ways of carving up the world through scientific lenses, I would walk around with this kind of matrix. And I share this also because this is part of what we're going to try to expand and help people deepen their sort of matrix of understanding of what is, and then that's going to position them to be oriented toward what ought to be, and how to sort of get out of, well, inadequate conventional frames and into deeper frames of understanding. And so, you know, I walk around with a sense of, oh yeah, my psychology is mediated by a nervous system. Of course, you know, 1,000 years ago, that was not well understood. I understand that, oh, tables, we build them, they're actually physically made of, like all the material, universe is made up of atoms, the electromagnetic waves are coming off the table. I'm not projecting anything into the world, it's absorbing that electromagnetic radiation. I'm processing that, and that's giving rise to a particular virtual image, if you will, neurobiological virtual field that affords me the opportunity to consciously experience the table. So this is just a sort of relatively common sense, but different than the first picture in the sense that it's common sense informed by a scientific understanding. But if you, once you internalize this, as is the case with all identification matrices, you basically, it drops into the backdrop of understanding. And so we take for granted that, and then we notice novelty and surprise. And you can apply, say, a Piaget frame, if you want, in relationship to sort of the identification matrix is just assimilating the agent arena relationship. And then it gets activated, and then it needs to accommodate when novel or mismatches emerge. So if I sit in a table that's actually a hologram and fall and hit my ass, it's like, whoa, I have to figure out what the hell is going on here in relationship to that. So that's your basic operating system, and the rotation on the coin is to emerge a fundamental set of awarenesses about what your current identification matrix might be, and then how you might expand that, okay? And ultimately, iQuad path is fundamentally about then expanding it into the tree of knowledge and the aspects of UTOK that map what is, and then ultimately also into the garden underneath the elephant sun god, which is going to then orient toward ought. And it's getting that right relationship between is and ought. That is essentially what's being invited in this iQuad coin into the path that ideally affords you a way to orient your life to cultivate wisdom energy. So last time we, because you had some background, I sent you some stuff and I was all excited and got off, I was like, oh, let me show you the equivalency. And we got into some of the backdrop. We were going to go through sort of the more common sense framings of expanding then the identity function into help people begin to take their normal framing of the identity and then place it in the everyday world, and then expand that into the refined view, at least that's then informed by UTOK. But at this juncture, we really just want to expand it into a more general view that I would say virtually every kind of reflective person should be able to at least acknowledge as a legitimate perspective of understanding. So one of the things that I said, okay, it symbolizes this identity function. Yes, people operate from their particular operating system, and we can recognize that. We're framing the unique subjective knower in the world. And that's a slightly novel play, but in relationship certainly to science, I think it's very fair to say that actually science struggles enormously with framing the unique subjective knower. And many sort of ontologies coming out of science say it's epiphenomenal or doesn't even exist. And I of course find that to be beyond absurd at one level. But I think they're really basically, it's like they don't really have a placeholder. So they forget if they're a blind spot in the language system, then they just don't know how to integrate it, rather than therefore that variable doesn't exist. And so the iQuad coin basically places that variable into the system. And obviously that should be pretty easy for us to do from a first person perspective. Oh yes, I exist. Who would have thunk it? We spoke loosely about this, but this is now, and this is a sort of a UTOK emphasis, but again, I don't think it's too much of a stretch, that a normal adult human would be able to pretty quickly recognize two domains of their conscious experience, especially if we define it thusly, like the person domain is the self-conscious reflective narrating egoic domain that you can explain your actions to other people. Notice that goes outside your head in a particular way. It's tied to culture. That's your person domain. And then you're embedded in the world as a primate through perspectival knowing, and we use John's frame here, perspectival, participatory, and procedural knowing would all be aspects of your basic primate. But essentially, virtually, oh yeah, you have a phenomenological consciousness and a egoic narrating consciousness. It's another way of saying that. That to me, that seems to be pretty straightforward in relationship to basically a long-standing cleave across many different domains of people that actually attend to consciousness that gets pretty quickly identified. And then in terms of the symbolization, to try to get in the right mindset, it symbolizes the humanity dialectic. In that regard, that's I am a human person. And then it then places me to reflect on what is my relationship between groups of people across maybe expanding socio-ecological domains. So my relationship to my wife, my daughter, my other daughter, and my son, those are all dyadic relations. Then we can expand that to, oh, that's our family as a unit. We have extended family, my parents, my wife's parents, my brothers, etc. And then, oh, what's our community? The UTOK community, the integral stage community. So then groups, and then you're placed in groups, and then you can have country identities. You can have all sorts of different kinds of identity, and then ultimately expanding, at least from the moral perspective of what kind of morality we'd want to engender. At very least, we would want to expand our understanding and empathy to all other humans. I certainly be oriented to all other sentient beings and aspects of the universe. But at a basic level, this is sort of getting the expansion at least aware of, how do I relate to other people in the world, and what is sort of best for humanity relative to my own life, and those are not the same things, and how do I think about that? The other clear element, philosophical element that this captures, this is in particular, whereas the H is sort of in the H of the shape of the iQuad, this is in the I to the fourth relation. It symbolizes a foundational dialectic in philosophy around questions about oneness and multiplicity, unity, diversity, integrated pluralism, if we use a general way of framing a meta-modern sensibility, that dialectic. So I noted Plotinus, I noticed the yin-yang symbol. These are all, I think, pretty ubiquitous in philosophy, is this reflections on this tension, and the iQuad relation of 1 equals I to the fourth symbolizes that, with the 1 being the one side, obviously I to the fourth representing aspects of many. And then finally, more closely to home in relationship to the unified theory, the coin itself is sort of, if you get the coin, where did the coin come from? Now you're going to relate yourself to that. The coin is offered in sort of as a psychotechnology to represent the idea that this part of the cosmos, meaning where we as humanity are in the 21st century, can be thought of as sort of this joint point, that we face an enormous number of meta crises, is the digital identity problem. That's particularly the techno-environmental crisis, the massive changes that digital bring to the world, the meaning and mental health crises all get coalesced into the meta crises, which I at times summarize at the digital identity problem. And then the idea here, and this is much more of an applied sort of value wisdom claim, is like, hey, if we can get people on the iQuad path and get oriented in the iQuad way, we'll create wisdom philosophies. And I'm certainly not saying it's the only one, but I'm saying it's added one to the system. And the more people that are operating on this operating system will afford us ways of wisely harmonizing with each other, with the world of the digital as it emerges, with nature, and the capacity for much greater levels of flourishing in the back half of the 21st century. So that's the sort of the summary of the identity function, as it were, that tries to connect people. Hey, you make an identity matrix. Oh, okay. That's framing yourself as a subjective knower. I'm sitting here in my house, and this means all of the things to me, and you're in your house, that means to you. And that starts with the subjective field, and then we expand into these. And now, so we're expanding the awareness of that identification matrix and bridging it into sort of the UTOK formulation. They're trying to keep the person also pretty well grounded at this juncture, and even into part 2, with pretty common sense views of their subjective field.
Great, that's all very clear. And I was thinking, when I mentioned I was thinking about some correlations with some of my work, when you're talking about the different levels following Harman of beholding the table. I was thinking about what I call ontochoreography. And
yes,
on one level, there's a way to deepen in your perception of any one of the grammatological frames.
Yep.
The nounal, from the naive to the scientific to, so you can go deeper into each one of those, but
Right.
you can also circulate them so that you can begin to notice how identity shows up in a more
Beautiful.
process-oriented frame,
Yep.
or a more prepositional frame, or a
Yes.
more adjectival qualitative display uh, field. So there's a way to circulate through those things and loosen our identity and
Mm,
expand the sense of identity.
totally.
So yeah, I see you touching on that there in a very helpful way.
Yeah.
Um,
Let's actually just in case folks haven't heard this. So the integral grammatology that you've developed orients us to think sort of to use the structure of grammar to develop a metaphysics or even transcendent metaphysics that affords us massive fluidity between concepts, but while maintaining a coherent integration. So just for people, so you can think of the world in terms of nouns, and I know many people have heard of this, but let's just make it clear for people that I haven't. So one grammar is nouns, the world of things. I was just talking to somebody, regarded sort of person. He's like, well, obviously ontology is just really, 20th or 19th century ontology is just all things. And it's like, well, yeah, mostly that's right. But of course, there's then processes like a Whiteheadian view, which then orients towards the flow of things. That's more verbal, and it's meaning not verbal. I mean, it's like as a verb, you think about the changes over time. There's adjectival, which are more emphasis on properties, especially maybe from a first person perspective. John, and maybe you have other individuals that did this, introduce adverbial, meaning the process by which you see and frame witness functioning. And then there's obviously prepositional, I feel like I'm missing, that's 5.
and
Which one am I?
pronounal for the
And pronounal, of course, the
perspective.
Wilberian, perspectival, I, it, we kind of thinking as an exemplar of that. So anyway, that, and it's certainly well known to you, but I'll say this again. I said this another time. I was listening to this and I literally stopped mid, step and had my identification matrix fundamentally expanded as I listened to you articulate this. Okay, because the prepositional framing all of a sudden created a fluidity of relation. Okay, that really, dropped some of my categories in a brilliant and beautiful way and afforded me an opportunity to expand them. So it's a great example then about how your set of insights afforded my identification matrix an area of growth and development.
Very cool. Yeah, I feel like that we're exercising in the same field right there.
Yep, totally.
And just to point people to the elusive eye conversation you had with John and Chris, which was just an excellent conversation. Obviously, I think that very neatly and powerfully dispenses with any of the, supposed any of the framings that would say that the self is just an epiphenomenon or illusory. I think you deal with that very clearly and nicely there. So framing the unique subjective knower, unity, multiplicity dialectic. I see that going on in terms of the dialogue around the individual and the individual, and maybe the dialectic between those two, and the integral and syntheist and other kinds of communities that are out there.
Definitely.
So yeah, I really just feeling what you're doing plugs in to a lot of important areas of thought and brings them together in a very nice way. So looking forward to see where you go with this.
Great. The other thing I'll just say, because it came up as an association, and I think you'll appreciate that, is as I was doing the back end of these iQuad things, the metaphysics of adjacency kept popping up with an enormous degree of frequency. And in fact, really, the journey that I build on the abstract back end of this is very much sort of an identification adjacent move. I identify adjacent, and create a matrix that way. I look forward to talking with Layman about that.
That's very cool. And just so an aside, we just did a dialogue with someone on the metaphysics of quality, which is Robert Pirsig's system.
Sure.
And looking at how that's basically an adjectival and adverbial ontology.
Beautiful. Yes, actually, it's right, especially adjectival, the way at least John and I would, I think, frame it. Beautiful articulation of that. All right, wonderful. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to basically, this is still anchored not into a deep dive, but an intermediate dive into then part two, where we want to take the kind of this level of identification matrix and then deepen it into sort of the psychology philosophy of UTOK. So, and just what I'll do before I dive into exactly that, I'll give a couple of general pictures for people to see where we're headed. The ultimate path that we're after, at least at the end of the iQuad thing, is the development of the logos path to wisdom energy. That's essentially where we're at. That affords the architecture, the logos architecture of right relation with is and ought. That's essentially the goal. Okay, you can't get an overalized, generalized relation because everyone's got to find their own iQuad path to right relation. So that's phronesis. But the argument here is at least here's a novel architecture that affords a logos frame. Okay, so this is our tree of knowledge. The argument is that out of the infinite void comes a observable universe. Okay, in terms of infinite void, if you wonder, well, what becomes before Big Bang? What is that, what a dark energy maybe even, or dark matter, at least in terms of it being dark and unclear. So then this would be the observable, at least as for right now, given our capacities to observe, observable universe mapped by the tree of knowledge. The floor of this can be represented as quantum field theory, whereby Planck's constant sort of creates limits of space-time energy knowability, as it were. I'm not going to get into that right now. But then we have the H factor of the human knower in general. And then there's scientific knowledge, scientific ontology, metaphysics, and epistemological justification systems for how the world works. The unified theory affords a particular map of that. It takes the tree of knowledge, elaborates that into the periodic table of behavior, and it says, hey, there's actually a way to map the ontic reality relative to the scientific ontology and scientific epistemology in a much clearer way. So this is just background. I wouldn't expect people to, oh, I know what you're talking about immediately. But this is kind of just a gestalt picture of this. This is a symbol from John Wheeler and his notion of the participatory universe, which is very congruent with my and John's kind of view, which is you have to figure out the position of the knower, and knowledge is going to be a knower-known relation at some level. And the knower participates in the construction of the knowledge, and how to do that, and what way it does that is one of the great questions of philosophy. And I think physics struggles with this much more than well, some metaphysical frames, and certainly that are more oriented, because the metaphysical frames start with knowers more than with just physical objects, and then you have to get to knowers that then know about the physical objects. So the tree of knowledge and UTOK in general, of course, we then have the coin, and a lot of what we're sort of trying to do is sort of see the H factor, and also see the H factor in the context of a wisdom philosophy. So this affords one way of looking at it. Here's another way of looking at it, which is here's you have an evolution of complexification from data, information into knowledge. The tree of knowledge maps that. The coin maps the individual. Then we want to cultivate wisdom and then transform it into cultivate knowledge, transform it into wisdom. We'll talk some about rotating and flipping the coin later, but ultimately you then flip the coin, find the path to the garden underneath the sun god, and that transforms, at least in this particular vision, is the process by which the flow of knowledge is transformed into wisdom to create a wisdom energy whole. Okay, so now what I want to do, that's the backdrop. Now we want to then drop into, all right, well, okay, help me understand my subjective conscious field. That's what this part is, in a bit of depth, so that I'm in a position to link this matrix, what you just described, with some degree of coherence for individuals that aren't, that didn't build the system. Like, what the hell is this? So what we're going to do is we're going to now, the first step we're going to make should be pretty congruent with what we've talked about. We'll call it the Q2 function. The Q2 function bridges objective quantifiable knowledge with subjective qualitative knowledge experiences. And it makes the point that these two empirical domains were split during the Enlightenment. We'll talk a little bit about that. So the quality, quantity, I was good. Persica's beautiful reference here in relation. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, for people that don't know, it's actually a really moving article, at least for me. It was a very powerful book that I read well, I read it. I didn't really understand it. I don't think this is all before the unified theory. 2007 or 8, I read that book again at a position to really absorb it, and was moved by it deeply, and saw his quest for what I would call scientific humanistic philosophy, and found myself deeply appreciating why quality represented that diamond, as it were, of truth, goodness, and beauty for him in an interesting way. Then we'll talk about the conscious field function. So the conscious field function just basically affords a little quick taxonomy of our ordinary waking consciousness into 4 different dimensions for us to be clear about. So I think that other knowledge systems, indeed, even like Augustine's knowledge systems and other have attended to the differentiation of the inner conscious field in ways that are far more sophisticated. I think we do a shitty job in our exterior epistemology of really clarifying. There has been actually some recent empirical work done, and I'm actually drawing off of some recent empirical work, just creating a taxonomy of conscious fields, and that's what this is actually drawn off of. Then from there, we go into the Q4 function, and this generates a clearer, generalizable, ontological and epistemological first-person frame for being in the world. And I think you and I can both appreciate this, because this is basically UTOK integral. It's a UTOK integral interface. And so I'll explain that in more detail, but that's the Q4 function. And then finally, we go to the iQuad formal function. And the iQuad formal function bridges this work, and at least it creates an adjacent identity between all of the subjective conscious field stuff into mathematics. And so the 4 functions then, Q2, conscious field, Q4, iQuad formal. And that then would bring us up to the next iteration, which then dives into the learning the background for the path at a more formal level. So fundamental epistemological insight of modern empirical natural science was the idea of observation framed in terms of intersubjective agreement about quantifiable change. Okay, that is, measurement coupled to experimentation provided a new way to transcend idiosyncratic subjective frames of reference and give knowledge that was grounded in the exterior quantitative frame. All right, so basically, hey, we need to measure stuff. We need to have sort of a generalizable observer that's trained but is interchangeable. And then through that sort of intersubjective agreement tied to quantification, replication, validity, we get objective knowledge, and that's true knowledge. And it is that the dominance of that, which was brilliant and could then translate into technology, it also really minimizes the place of subjective knowing, or at least has that particular danger. And I think that that's just basically the way it's unfolded. I'm going to use, here's a picture from Stephen Hawking's The Universe in a Nutshell. And what it shows here is the observer looking back through time at the Big Bang singularity. One of the things that's relevant about it is what's the nature of an observer. And in physics, basically the nature of an observer is anything that can detect information off of it. Okay, so any measurement device. And it is this. So when the physics certainly cares about observers, okay, and both quantum mechanics and general relativity were huge. Part of their insights was that, hey, you had to really position the observer. By the way, even the original insights from Galileo were centered around how do we create a generalizable frame. So he was very concerned with, for example, watching a cannonball drop from a ship, okay, and then watching how people were at the shore would watch the ship go by. And he built frames for that. So the position of the observer, if you're going to deal with behavior, which I argue that science does, it's really behavior then that's observed if you're dealing with empirical behavior. So you do have to put the observer in relation. But the observer can simply be something that I spectralize as a slice of information relevant for whatever, and that can be a measurer. Okay. And really, I would argue that essentially then the physics deals with unfolding energy, and information that can be pulled off of it, but it then doesn't know really how to deal with how does information get pulled off of it turn into knowledge and justified science. That's at least my critique of like a physicist theory of everything. So the argument is that science emerged from Enlightenment 1.0, subtle plug that we need Enlightenment 2.0, failed to account for a human knower ultimately. And while I'll justify that by, well, the first thing I've already sort of articulated why. Here we have sort of the language of science, generalizable, lawful, nomenclatic, reliable. We have the language of the subjective self. And what we've been focusing on here to set the stage for this Q2 thing is this, hey, you have a placeholder, at least in the iQuad coin, relative to the tree of knowledge. That puts them in relation. So now I want to be clear about, okay, let's be a little bit clearer about how this then gives rise to the Q2 function. There's quantitative, qualitative. So here is Hawking and his measurement device. And here is a drawing that I made of the tree of knowledge prior to the Hawking diagram. In fact, one of my cool moments is that I drew this 10 months before. My parents got me that book on the December of 2001. And I had a flurry of diagrams in January of 2001. I have sort of a UTOK manifesto that has like 7 different diagrams that come out of it. And I was in one of my little manic phases in January to February of 2001. And this was one of the diagrams that I developed. And when I turned to the page and saw that Hawking diagram, I literally, everyone's at Christmas and, you know, I'm flipping through and I jumped out of the chair and said, that's my diagram. And everyone's like, what the fuck are you talking about? You know? It's like, this is the diagram. That doesn't look like it. It's, no, it's the mirror image without the knower. And everybody's like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. But that's essentially what it is. It's a mirror image without the knower. And so the model that in terms of the model of epistemology is really that science fundamentally is the active process of trying to factor out the subjective knower to yield an objective description. But the way you do that is not just through math and logic and experimentation, but you actually have to know the architecture of knowledge that began the process. It's not like all of a sudden that history disappears, okay? And the argument really is physics has no real way to ground the emergence of justification systems, essentially. Doesn't know what those are. It feels that it can get rid of them and reduce it to analytics. And the argument is, no, actually analytics emerge out of justification and you actually have to have that bridge. You know, this is sort of the physics version, but to actually get knowledge about it, okay? What you have is you have individual knowers, and then really science is then seen as the development of the anti-subjective knower. Okay? And then we can put these two things like this so that the coin still carries the place of the knower from that first person perspective. And then the emergence of science and scientific knowledge, in this case represented by the tree of knowledge, emerges out of the scientific method, which basically tries to eliminate the idiosyncratic individual from blind randomized controlled trials or whatever and generate a generalizable objective. So, but the architecture then of the iQuad and TOK provide a way to connect the objective world and the subjective world, as opposed to in Enlightenment, and basically just eliminate it. So we can have two sides of the coin here, rather than just, oh, there's one side that's really dominant. I think Wilber does a really nice job of, but that dominance then shrinks the other, you know, subjective humanistic aspects of knowing. But with the TOK and coin together, we can say, hey, no, each of us wanders around in the world, right? Okay, and some of us. Yes, there it is. You can see the light there, Bruce. I know. And in fact, then we can have then a generalized map that then places each of our lives. You know, my parents, your parents get hammered one night, and voila, all of a sudden the journey starts, right? And so you become a little zygote, and then ultimately, you know, you find yourself as a wandering human being with a particular epistemological portal in the world with all the other people that are wandering around. And so we get 7.8 billion of them. But the point of it is that this map clearly provides a very clear frame for the position of each of our idiosyncratic epistemological portals relative to the generalized frame. as opposed to the matter-mind confusion of general standard Enlightenment models. Okay, so that's the Q2 function. It's basically, oh, it's two sides of the coin. We can put the coin. There's a qualitative subjective. One thing I've noted, or at least I write about in my book, is like, yes, we should be very clear that there's two fundamentally different dimensions of the word, definitions of empiricism. So empiricism originally is first-person observation. I empirically see this table, and then it becomes scientific systematic third person, which is measurable, quantitative. And we lose right now, oh, you know, empirical evidence, right? If everyone says in generally empirical evidence, and you say, yeah, I saw empirical evidence that masks don't work because I wandered around without a mask and didn't get a sickness. And people are like, that's not empirical evidence. You know, it's like, well, okay, you know, what is empirical evidence? Well, systematic scientific is third person objective quantified. But of course, first person is, hey, this is what I see. We need clarity about those, and this provides a frame for proper relation. Okay, now we want to then drop into the first person and then just talk, map the conscious field function. So here's the conscious field function. This is based on actually some empirical work done on what's called pristine inner experiences. There's a methodology here that somebody developed. And I should have checked on this guy's name. I haven't seen this in a little while, so I'm blanking on his name. I apologize if this guy happens to be listening, although I shot him a note to try to talk to him and I never heard back. So maybe this is my passive aggressive attempt to demonstrate resistance and resentment. All right, so here it is. To set the stage for the conscious field function, I'm going to introduce, and folks will be pretty aware of this probably, my map of mind 1, 2, 3, which is the work that I've done to try to delineate the epistemology, ontology of mental process in right relation. So mind 1B, that's overt activity of animals, what you would see from the outside, the animal doing. Mind 1A refers to neurocognitive information. Mind 2 is the conscious experience of being, the epistemological portal, you know, for the valence qualia into adjectival, adverbial qualia, and global neuronal workspace kinds of stuff. Mind 3A in humans is the egoic justification system, and mind 3B is what I'm doing right now, talking publicly into the world along those lines. So that's mind 1. And we can see that behavioral investment theory at least provides an exterior empirical science of that. Mind 3, justification in the TOK provide an exterior framework for that. There's the interior position of mind 2, and iQuad fundamentally is about that. Okay, and then we talked about the person side. Well, that's the narrator, and the experiential side, that's the primate. Okay, person narrator. Okay, so now let's then talk about the inner conscious field of mind 2. So 1, pretty straightforward, and by the pristine experimental inner pristine experiences is this way, is the methodology this guy delineated these categories where I'm pulling off of them, is that he'd give people a little beeper, a reminder, and he would just, whenever it go off, these subjects would simply have to look, like, I don't remember exactly, but I think it's 3 to 5 seconds or 8 seconds back, and state without any interruption, or as unmediated as possible, what exactly was on your field of attention. Okay, and then he classified the things that were on the field of attention in the following categories. Okay, there were a total of 5, and I'll get to the 5th one at the end, but this is 1, exterior sensory awareness. Okay, so that's specifically focusing on adjectival properties, basically. Okay, ooh, this feels cold, or what is the shape of this? Okay. The second, interior interoception feelings of the body, especially like if you're in pain. Like last week, I was dealing with my sciatic nerve, so I spent a fair amount of time drawing my attention back into that thing that was waving at me and getting close in my body. I was much more aware of that. So this is basic valence qualia, feelings, pleasure, pain, appetite, drives, things along those lines, and certainly rise up into emotional states. Probably the most common is sort of an inner scene. Basically, that is seeing the landscape and thinking about it in terms of essentially affordances and stressors. So that when we really think and we're collapsing a lot in our identity matrices, we're collapsing a lot and seeing, oh, here's a possibility down the road. How do I get this job? How do I ask this girl out? All of these other kinds of issues. It's a matrix of particular And that this would be a sort of the vision logic. And I don't mean that in the Wilberian sense. I mean sort of visual imagery and reasoning sense, where you're collapsing different categories together and rotating them around in your image, and then talking about it in relation. So you have a private narrator. So these are 4 different categories that he identified. In terms of my own taxonomy, the inner speech, because it can flow into the world in a different sort of way, is a different category, but that certainly can afford us. So hopefully, and now that I'm getting more aware of the yogic version, I'll just say this: what we're talking about is normal waking state consciousness. So not, the meditative states and everything else obviously start to afford us a whole another set of categories and new states, and we should attend to this, but this is just normal waking consciousness mapping. Okay? So the last thing I'll say is, the inner witness function is this is an adjectival frame that will drop around. And a lot of these, if we're at least sort of attending on them, in the past, I would have just called them qualia, but I now really see them as, these are adjectival qualia being framed by an adverbial witness function. That's helpful. John's distinguishing those 2 kind of grammars, as it were. And the last thing that I'll share is in the research, this guy found that there was a good set of ideas that he called unsymbolic thought, okay, that lacked any kind of vision or any kind of even narrative. And it was, it just was, I'm thinking about something, but I don't really have a picture. So for me, when I read this, it was like, I had a thought, like I was earlier that day, I was kind of struggling with the old Socrates question of what is justice, okay? And I was on a walk, and I realized that, I had a lot of thoughts about justice that really weren't pictures and they weren't narrative. I was mulling the concept of justice over in my head, but I would have been hard pressed to say I had a picture in my head of that, or even a narrative. Okay, it was just sort of the concept somehow was fused in my consciousness. I knew it was a problem I was working on. I'm going to call that here just intuition. He got into, I know there was some pushback for people to say, well, unsymbolized thought could potentially be confusing, but basically sort of, you can be conscious that you're mulling shit over, but you don't necessarily have any genuinely adjectival clarity that's associated with the thought. Okay. So here's your conscious field function, basically 4 domains of your subjective conscious experience, 4 of which are very clear in terms of their presentation. The 5th is sort of fuzzy, but clearly something I want to give credit to and say it's, obviously I'm trying to jam these also into 4 so that it's easier to remember because everything's 4 in this little presentation. Okay, so inner seeing, inner speech, sensory awareness, feeling from the body. And so the iQuad then conscious field is like, in terms of building the matrix, consciousness really isn't just one thing. We're actually now starting to develop a much richer, nuanced, differentiated version of this thing that we call consciousness. And we did it in terms of agent arena identification matrix. And now we're doing it in terms of the richness of the witness function and what it witnesses and the domains of that. Okay. And then finally, or not finally, the next we can now shift into from the conscious field, Q2 conscious field now into Q4, and this is called the quadrant quadratic. Q4 bridges into an onto-epistemology that includes both subjective conscious experience and the exterior real world. And like I said, you'll know where we're going in this direction. And it starts then, it's the quadrant quadratic. And so I'm pulling right off of Wilber here. So the Wilberian quadrants of interior, exterior, individual, collective, that then affords the pronounal grammar of how to view the world from the inside individual, inside collective, outside individual, outside collective view. And the terms for this, I think, are very, very useful. Certainly thinking in terms of my own phenomenology, that's then deep mind, not deep, but really embedded in my perspectival mind too. Culture, my justifying mind, then hooks up with you, and okay, we're in an integral stage culture or UTOK culture. That's we space, and really, I think justification systems in humans are necessary for really coordinating those. There's behavior, what am I doing, and then what are the large scale systems that we were embedded in that are contextualizing that behavior. And UTOK offers particular kinds of frames of reference in that. I'm not going to get into those, but basically, if you were enriching your identification matrix, this affords then opportunities to do that. So now the iQuad basically is like, oh, okay, I'm going to enhance my capacity of moving my perspective around so that I can now be, oh, yes, this is my perspective. This is our we perspective. This is how other people would see us systemically or at the individual level. And this gives the quadrant aspect of the function. So the quadrant is basically stealing from, or, appropriating. I've engaged in appropriation, Bruce. Somebody call somebody. Appropriating Wilber, okay, and then placing it in the context of a really perspectival shift. And I'll appropriate you too by basically saying you can flow prepositionally, or the prepositional grammar, and broaden all of that lensing. But this is a useful as the popularity and fecundity of Wilber's thought evidence is that quadrant system is pretty damn useful in terms of thinking about lots of different things. Okay, so that's the quadrant part. Now the quadratic, and that, by the way, is heavily epistemological. Notice that it's all about sort of the framing of the knower and moving around, and then how that affords the capacity to aspectualize different aspects and features of the universe or yourself and the self-world relation in different ways. And now we can shift into the quadratic, which is much more ontological in terms of its claiming. And the ontology then is in the tree of knowledge. So the ontology of the tree of knowledge identifies the 4 different planes of existence as the grounded ontology. Maybe, and I'll say this is not necessarily completely restrictive in the sense that energy may be beneath matter at one level, and maybe there are higher planes of conscious awareness that we'll get. But in terms of our current grounding of just noticing the world, matter, life, mind, and culture afford a particular kind of 4 planes of existence that the tree of knowledge maps. It also captures an aspect of the multiplicity unity dimension in the sense that as I wander around, I'm both one and I'm all 4 of these. And of course, you can individual differentiation that dialectic. So the matter, I'm a physical body on the energy matter space-time grid. My butt's pressing in against this chair at a particular amount of weight, given the gravity. I'm giving off heat in a particular way. I'm absorbing certain things. My genetic cellular organismic structure is metabolizing energy at a particular level. I'm able to move procedurally, and I have felt experiences of being in the world. And of course, I'm narrating both some privately, but much of it now in this presentation is just basically the mind 3B narrating of this structure. And this is a symbol from or graphic from the elusive eye that basically says the architecture of the self can be framed along this line, experiential into narrating egoic self. So this then gives us the quadratic, where initially we've been wandering around the interior. Now all of a sudden we're helping individuals grow, expand their identification matrix, shift perspectives. You never actually fully get out of your perspective, but all sorts of psychotechnologies, education, and knowledge can help you move from being grounded in your naive phenomenology and expand into the capacity to see the world from a wide variety of different domains. That's your epistemological expansion. And then the ontological claim that we can at least, a very useful way of seeing the world ontologically is the differentiation of matter, life, mind, and culture. And I can do some cool retro shit with that.
I love it.
So that's the Q4. So we Q2, then we did conscious field, basically waking sensory stuff, into exterior, interior imagery, narrative, and sort of some intuitive thing, then expand this identification matrix through the insights, say, of Wilber and the great chain of being / UTOK to ground our ontology into a quadratic. And then finally, what we've been doing really is talking about first person and third person empiricism, but there's also a logical architectural structure, both at the level of sort of formal logic. And then ultimately, as I was just talking to a physicist and trying to share some of him, he's like, well, math is everything. Like he was a mathematical ontological guy, and was like, well, and I don't know, basically math's the only language that really confers true knowledge. I'm like, well, I don't know about that. But anyway, that was where he was coming from. And certainly the whole, we now need from the structure of this is to also at least make adjacent and then build bridges into math. And that starts with the formal function. And we've already talked about this of iQuad referring to the imaginary square root of -1. So that's what I is. I squared is -1, I to the 4th is 1. The iQuad coin is in the shape of the circle, and this is the complex unit circle complex plane, which is imaginary on the y-axis typically, and real on the x-axis. And ultimately, this gives rise to the complex number plane, which is a whole branch of mathematics. And it's interestingly, as a foreshadow, it's a branch of mathematics that then becomes very salient in physics, in particularly quantum mechanics, field theory, and even in general relativity. And this is then, in addition to the complex plane, we can actually also add, and this is work from Leonhard Euler, add the natural log function and the Euler formula, which relates to the concept of the way in which an exponential imaginary real relation. I'm not going to get into too much of that, but just basically for now, trust me, I pulled this off of a real math thing, and it is genuine mathematical complex numbers. And the iQuad is representing an adjacency, a conceptual identity adjacency, but basically saying, hey, we've now created a subjective field, and now our subjective field is entertaining the mathematical logic relations of the complex plane. And in relationship to what that affords is, hey, we can then think about this in terms of things like -1 + 1, or -I plus I, or even e to the pi I plus I to the 4th. All of those create certain kinds of equivalencies. And ultimately, the argument will be is that matrix of equivalency sets the ground for a formal set of logical relations, a fluid formal set of logical relations that afford conceptual operators that allow physicists to go out and map physical phenomena. And that is what sets the UTOK and tree and coin apart from, because it says, oh, I actually have a container that affords us a placeholder for the subjective physicists doing work. And rather than having to eliminate that as, oh, that's just all subjective bullshit, and then we're discovering what truth is, it affords us clarity about how the subjects work together to create intersubjective objective knowledge. And we don't have to break our understanding. We can maintain a whole consilient understanding because we now know where the place of this is, as opposed to just saying, well, it's too goddamn complicated to figure out what the knower is. We'll just factor them out with math and experiment. Okay, so bottom line is human identity function divided up into these 4 subfunctions: Q2, conscious field, Q4, and the formal function. Okay, ultimately then, and I think this wraps it up. So the combination summary point of iQuad and TOK allows one to deepen one's metacognitive observing capacity, okay, understand oneself as an observer. And then I'm going to situate this as, I'm going to pull the periodic table of behavior in and say, hey, I kind of go back to that identity matrix where I had the person looking at the table. Here's a more advanced way of thinking about the way you might see the world as you really become proficient in the TOK and periodic table of behavior, which is dividing the world up into an ontological layered cake of 12 different domains. Okay. This is a pull off of Unity of Science people. They built a thing called the ontological layered cake. It only had 6 different floors in it, arranged slightly different. The periodic table, in fact, starts with the basement floor of energy information field being everything. You see that in Big Bang. You see it in quantum field theory. Particles are disturbances in the field. Atoms then are a collection of those. Molecules, then we go across scale into things like big things, Earth and suns and solar systems and galaxies. Then we see the emergence of the prebiotic soup and molecular biology that somehow translate into fully functional cells as the fundamental unit of life. They then grow into bigger organizations, into the multi-cell colonies across ecologies. And then about the Cambrian explosion, we get neural networks tied together into complex active bodies and brains to give rise to what we call mind one, at least animal behavioral activity. They get into groups, evolve over 500 million years or so. Then we see symbolic justification, say 100,000 years ago, the person justifying egoic system, unifying a family into a cultural anthropological system. And then ultimately, we're going to start merging with technology at the level of civilization over the last 5,000-10,000 years, and ultimately build science. And then finally, we're observers as a long traditional history of that, looking back now and seeing the identification matrix, and are then, hey, transcending that identification matrix into maybe a higher level of consciousness that transcends conventional understanding, that affords us an opportunity perhaps to see deeper down and then broader up truths, and arrange ourselves in relationship to that. And you get sort of a 13th floor view down into the basement and see the whole, and then that starts the process of really then creating an identity matrix, identification matrix. So that is part 2 of the tour in relationship to the iQuad coin.
That's great. I'm just noticing so many correspondences. I don't know which way to to go with it, but I think that for me is one of the clearest presentations I've gotten from you on the architecture of this and the intent of this, and some of the psychotechnological affordances of this.
I love that frame, yeah.
So I really appreciate it. One thing that we talked about off camera that I'll mention here,
Please,
that I feel you're in accord with, is basically a tantric sensibility and a tantric approach, which fundamentally looks at shifting the self-world formulation through a series of transformations, ultimately to arrive at a more liberated and wise way of inhabiting the world, one that is much more deeply participatory, you could say translucent, to the deeper, probably, what you're pointing to actually with the formal level of, the formal layer of the coin. That's, you could say that that's pointing yogically to the causal level. It's pointing to the basic fundamental syntax of things that makes the appearance of worlds at all possible. And of course, you're pointing towards that as a language system, in a sense, mathematical language system. But there's a lot that you can realize in working in that territory.
Totally.
But
can you, as I confessed to you off camera, I don't think I knew Tantra Sutra terminology until literally 2 years ago on Bard's List. I mean, that's probably indicative of my own narrowness in the world at some level, but I'm probably not alone, at least in the Western world of conventional people, to not know exactly the Tantra Sutra frame. And of course, I'm still learning. Can you, Bruce, share a little? That was a wonderful articulation of a slice of Tantra. Can you give folks just a little bit of background about those terms and what they mean, just for folks that would hear them for the first time, say Tantra?
Right. Yeah. I'm definitely not talking about sexual cavorting in your office here.
Right. Well, that's right. So that would be my first inclination. Like, oh my God, Bruce is talking about porn. I was, that's, of course, I learned it from Bard. So that's where the first,
it could be right with Bard.
But anyway, let's talk a little bit about that concept, because it's not super prevalent in Western thought, the difference, but it's much more prevalent in Eastern thought.
Right. And there are different ways to frame it and look at it. You could say that the sutric approach on one level is more conventional level teaching, which starts with what you perceive to be self and world. And then it gives you some rules for operating in that arena to make that more functional. And so it sets up boundaries, it sets up rules, it establishes rights and wrongs. And basically the sutric teachings don't really fundamentally work yet at transforming the that given architecture, it works with them to make it more functional, right?
Okay.
So, for instance, just looking at somebody with alcoholism or some other kind of, psychological
Right.
issue, the first thing you want to do is to lay out very clear boundaries. And you identify, I am an alcoholic, and therefore I have certain characteristics. I have certain ways that I need to behave. There's certain hard and fast boundaries I need to draw in
Okay.
order to maintain my health
Yep.
and keep the negative away. So it works very conventionally, but constructively and pro-socially to help you become more functional. And it
Sure.
does work subtle levels of transformation, but it's not radical necessarily. Though it folds in the radical into the way it points in different directions,
Okay.
but it does so by tracing these pretty clear boundaries and establishes rules, and it works by, for instance, applying antidotes to if you have this issue, then you apply this antidote to deal with that issue.
Fascinating.
Right?
Okay.
Right. The tantric level.
Can I say then maybe that would so when I first heard it outside the sex context, and I'm steeped in psychology, so I sort of went to Kohlberg. Okay, so Kohlberg sort of like in a conventional, I sort of had an association of sutra with conventional, and then tantra would be some sort of post-conventional break of that and awareness in a particular way. Is that it? Does that overlap in any way with you think the relation?
Yes, it does, definitely. Okay. Right, because you can, at the tantric level, you basically begin to perceive the functionality of the conventional, but also the limitations of the conventional. And one of the insights there are different ways you can approach it, but in this particular system, one of the ways that begins to shift is that rather than just taking all of the labels that we receive about different mind states and different emotions and different wholesome and unwholesome qualities at face value, we begin to recognize them at a deeper level as all types of plays of energy. And as types of plays of energy, they become more workable. Wow. And they express in particular ways within a context, but you begin to recognize how that context is set up, and you can then begin to work with those distinctions and violate them in deliberate ways to basically release some potentials that are locked up in maybe a narrower framing.
That's fucking like psychotherapy, Bruce.
Right.
You mean I've been doing tantric shit all along?
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
That's weird. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
Right. Yeah. So there's a strong correspondence there. Just with obviously with tantra, they're working in a different
sure.
a different modality.
Obviously, right.
But I think there's a parallel there, and there's an interest in progressively helping the individual to transgress certain given boundaries in order to realize more degrees of freedom, right, and more degrees of the workability of their own experience and self-world dynamics. And one of the, there's the generation phase, and basically I don't want to go into all the technicality there, but with tantra, one of the things that it works on is helping you transform your sense of identity and your relationship to the world, and it does so through various kinds of embodied practices and visualization practices, where you deconstruct your sense of self and world in very deliberate ways, and then reconstruct them in more sacred mythopoetic ways. Wow. Recognizing that this is a construction. It's not, it doesn't commit you to a belief that, you have to take these things literally, because at the end of the process, you dissolve what you construct. So you just do that, but you begin to learn to inhabit new configurations of self and world that proceed through stages. So it's basically a process of, getting deeper and deeper insight into self-world construction and ultimately expanding those
Mhm.
self-world constructions, making them subtler and more refined, and ultimately reaching a point where it's, trans-justification, where
Mhm.
you're able to rest in the presentation of things, and what you've all constructed and built, it remains operational, but
Right.
it's no longer a ground of identification for you.
Gosh, I'm feeling that because as you know, and we just announced, so me and John Vervaeke and Zach Stein just sort of we're wrapping up a cognitive science show series on on human transformation and a meta psychology that's up to the task. And I swear we should at some point, whenever this comes out relative to that show, what you just afforded there and that narrative, and undoubtedly it's known by many wisdom traditions, that would have been just such a brilliant articulation in many ways, what I would think we were sort of groping at in some ways. Zach's got some good knowledge, and so does John in relation. I'm more impaired in my limitations in that regard, but I just love the way you articulated what that tries to engender, the kinds of transformations of identity that kinds to engender, and then what that affords in terms of kind of how you will be in the world in a sophisticated, rich, nuanced, complex, flexible way. So anyway, I just deeply appreciate that.
I'd like to give just a little metaphor that I sometimes share in my classes. It's a framing that I shared in transpersonal psychology classes, even though it comes from the tantric
Mhm.
and Dzogchen traditions. Dzogchen is considered kind of one of the highest, Dzogchen or Mahamudra in the Tibetan system,
Mhm.
one of the highest levels of teaching.
Okay.
And for many centuries, it was only shared individual to individual,
Mm.
or even just spoken orally and
Mhm.
not
Hmm.
necessarily, codified, um,
Mhm.
because of its subtlety, but also because of the license it would appear to give you if you took it in a naive way,
Mm.
that you couldn't really, that it would give you a sense that there's nothing to do, and it might not be very useful. Um, but
Hmm.
so in the sutric system, you draw the clear boundaries. There's rights
Mhm.
and wrongs, do's and don'ts,
Right.
and very programmatic way of working with things, and holding to virtues and avoiding vices, and all of that um, works well with the
Standard
initial.
egoic rationalism, kind of.
Exactly, and that's it works well with initial approach to Alcoholics Anonymous and many other kinds of
Right.
therapeutic modalities. Tantra works at transformation,
Mhm.
and it begins to playfully transgress boundaries so that you can begin to see that even in the vices, there may be some wisdom, even
Mhm.
in the negative states,
Yeah.
anger and other kinds of conditions, there may be something that's actually still useful to you
Sure.
in terms of the function of your overall system, especially if you don't plug it in to the basic level of ego identification, but allow it to liberate its more energetic potentials as things that can be contributed to the overall functioning of your system.
Totally.
So
Mhm.
conventionally, they would talk about, anger
Mhm.
is destructive for the sutric approach.
Right.
Anger can give you a white flame-like clarity that's very useful in your interactions,
Right.
as long if you don't let it take over you.
Mhm. So it's kind of
Um,
almost like a Nietzschean from in Western, like Nietzsche would then be in sort of critiquing the sutra in a particular kind of way if we jam this into a Western sort of philosophical frame, as it were, perhaps.
exactly. Yes.
Mm.
Yeah. And so, um, you know, there's an alchemical uh, kind of orientation to Tantra, where
Mhm.
it says you have a system that's this way, we can work with it and subtly transform it into something else.
Wow.
And so there's a very progressive way of working through the different constellations of self-world identity systems and alchemically transmuting them into different and more refined forms. And then Dzogchen basically would say, uh, the metaphor that is used here is snow falling on the ocean.
Okay.
And the snow hitting the ocean is released into the ocean,
Mhm.
and there's no difference. And so from the Dzogchen point of view, in certain refined states of awareness, which they call Rigpa, there's nothing you need to do to any mental arising, any mental
Right.
configuration, because it's of the same nature, the same
Yep.
energetic nature as the awareness itself.
Right.
And if you're able to just hold that awareness, you don't have to consciously transform the elements and the configurations. They will spontaneously release themselves into that more holistic, very
Right.
stable field. And so it's a way of inhabiting the contents of your mind that's non-manipulative, and it doesn't take any of the elements ontologically in a naive way or identify with them. And in that way, it allows them to what they would call, you know, spontaneously self-liberate.
Mm.
Basically, they release their potentials without laying down conditioning tracks in the brain.
Wow. Beautiful. I love that. I'm getting associations to Rob Scott and his fundamental shift notions. I'm also, that's an underdeveloped area in my unified approach to psychotherapy. So the unified approach to psychotherapy is really trying to get the centered ground of what psychotherapy is in the West and the core principles that foster that. And then it hones in on classic neurotic problems and affords a sophisticated psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, humanistic, but really rational egoic approach to reverse the neurotic looping. Okay. Which at the level of if you're coming in for psychotherapy and all that other stuff, that's fine. But in terms of deep transformation, I've always felt that there's another, like, other systems, cultivate sort of that almost the magic potential, sort of they turn the systems into, what is with so much fluidity that all of a sudden, and then you can sort of really create that shamanistic transformation in terms of how to relate. And I have some sense of what's happened to me in relationship to that, but I'm not trained in that regard. And that's really what that's also activating. It's like, wow, you can really start to bridge into those healing traditions in a particular way. Kind of what psychedelics are doing and, would be equivalent in some ways almost in terms of the effect that they have on the identification matrix, as it were.
Exactly. Yeah, I feel that there is uh, a confluence that's beginning to happen. That's, as we begin to understand more about what's going on in Tantra as a way of working and in Dzogchen as a way of working, um, while not wanting to be culturally appropriating, we can nevertheless recognize that we're basically fundamentally human beings, and there's ways of working with our internal systems and our meaning making systems and our self-world construction. And it doesn't have to necessarily be plugged into a certain metaphysics to still be useful knowledge. And I'd like to see you talk, for instance, with Forrest Landry, because I understand he has the Western core Tantra, which he's beginning to articulate,
Hmm.
which is tantric and shamanic principles applied in Western frameworks. And we just did an interview on our channel with a guy named Craig Kaminsky, who's also looking at all the preliminary practices of Tantra through a Western lens that allows us to plug it into psychotherapy and
Wow.
into Greek wisdom and things like that. So I think there's a lot
That's
that can be afforded here. And to me, what I'm hearing from you already contains so many of the elements and also brings something else that's not there that I think it could be a really useful, deepening dialogue.
that sounds super exciting because that's an area I feel I have just an outline for. I mean, like I said, embarrassingly, I'm confessing Tantra and Sutra are new vocabulary where it's only 4 years old or 3 years old for me. So that shows you where I am in that regard. But I have a sense of that. And of course, my psychotherapy training, which is pretty rich and broad, and the nature of psychotherapy forces you into all sorts of possibilities in dealing with people's identification matrix, self-world stuff. But it's not developed in that regard. It's stuck in an egoic rationalism Because the nature of institution of psychotherapy in the West is basically, hey, you got to manage these people and regulate them. We're
Exactly.
sort of like social control forces and secular priests going, oh, fuck, we can't have these people suffering and not working, basically. And so we don't foster them going crazy. But there are these shamanic issues that afford a different kind of relationship. And you see this some in some of the experiential therapies. But there's clearly a huge and fruitful set of bridges. I'm glad you also brought up Forrest Lange. I have back-channeled him some. One of these days, I hope to open up that line of communication. I've listened to some of his conversations with John. At first, it was a little confusing to me, but I'm starting to hear serious and deep resonance with his immanent metaphysics. And if he's developed a Western Tantra kind of thing, that's all the more glorious to check it out.
Great, great.
So.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing all of this. It's like, as I mentioned, it was to me a very clear overview that really gave me a new insight into what you're up to, and I really appreciate it.
Great, man. Well, I deeply appreciate you joining me on this journey, and I will rope you back in for part 3 if you're so willing, and we'll find a time to do that maybe in a month or whatever. We'll get some time in the upcoming weeks. I'm also excited to, once we start releasing these episodes, this conversation about, we'll have some cross dialogue about transformation perhaps, and sacred naturalism, and hell, we just got all sorts of different stuff to do. So it's going to be great.
Exciting. That's great.
All righty. Thanks so much, Bruce.
All right. Thank you. Have a great day.
Mm-hmm.